Okay, dear legal community, we need to have a little bit of a serious conversation about a growing problem when it comes to legal communications. Defining things that don't need to be defined. Somewhere along the way in law school, most lawyers will have touched upon very briefly the concept of plain English drafting. And as they did so, what will have happened is they will have learned about things like dot point lists or exclusive definitions versus non-exclusive definitions. And along the way there, something will have come up about defined terms. And you will have learned that defining things can offer precision and clarity to your legal drafting, and that fundamentally that is a good thing to do. That is true, provided it offers precision or clarity to your writing. What seems to have happened, though, is we have embraced the concept of defined terms so wholeheartedly that we now just define things at every available opportunity. Every sentence, every paragraph, even the shortest communications are now coming laden with multiple and often unnecessary defined terms. So let's have a little bit of a talk about defined terms, what they are actually for, when they are useful and when they aren't useful, and then a couple of examples where I feel like it's just getting a little bit silly, to be perfectly honest. So why do we define things? Well, we might define things for a number of reasons. Firstly, we want to be precise. If we're going to use a word and there might be any possibility for ambiguity about its meaning, then we want to define that term so that there can be no ambiguity. We want to make it clear what we're talking about. If we're going to use a particular phrase, then that is a good use for a defined term. Sometimes we want to collect a larger concept within a defined term. So maybe we have a list of representations in a misleading or deceptive conduct case, and rather than writing them out in full every time, we just want to define all of them as the representations or the misrepresentations, depending on which side of the case we happen to be on. That is also a valid and useful way of defining things. And along with precision, we sometimes want some clarity. That is, if there is a possibility for something to have a number of different meanings, then we want it to be clear what we are talking about when we are using a particular word. So those together, those concepts, and there is a bit of an overlap between precision and clarity. I probably should have defined them when I started talking. But what we get is the concept that a defined term is designed to amplify, increase, or clarify your writing. However, we don't need to define everything just because it exists. And this is what I'm seeing happen more and more. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples where we're really overusing or unnecessarily using defined terms. Now, is it the end of the world to define something that doesn't strictly require a definition? Probably not. But it is sloppy, and it is a little bit lazy, and it's not good lawyering at the end of the day to do things that are unnecessary. All that tells me, if you're sending me that, is that you wrote this particular thing on autopilot. You saw a term, you defined it, because that's what we do. We define terms when we're writing things. Sometimes we define terms that don't even get used again. We just were working through and we thought, oh, that needs a defined term. Oh, there's a defined term opportunity there. I'm going to define the heck out of that thing. So we don't really need to do that in every case. There are a couple of examples which tend to come up more and more regularly, and I'm not 100% sure why, that I thought I would use as the basis for you might define something when, or you might not define something when situation. So the first is this, defining the correspondence to which you are replying. So it's a pretty common way of opening a piece of legal correspondence where you go, we refer to the above matter. I hate that phrase. I'll come back to that in another video. We refer to your letter dated blank, okay? You are responding to a particular letter. And then more and more, for some reason, we are going, your letter as a defined term. But why? Does defining that term offer any clarity, precision, or bundling together things that might help this letter? Does it amplify the meaning of the letter? Does it assist us in any way to use that defined term other than the fact that we like capitalizing things? And the answer in that particular case is no. If you are responding to a single letter, there is nothing to be gained by defining the reference to that letter. You can just call it your letter. There's only one thing that your letter could possibly mean, and that is the letter to which you have already said you are replying. Nothing is gained by defining that. You achieve very little other than adding more words to your correspondence and making it look a little bit more lawyery because it's now got an extra defined term in your opening stanza. So, your letter does not need to be defined, but what about a circumstance where we are responding to multiple pieces of correspondence? Maybe we have a particularly letter-happy opponent in a piece of litigation and they have written us 6 letters over the last 3 days and we are replying to all 6 in the interest of efficiency. If they are dealing with different subject matter and if we are going to respond to them separately, we might, if we're going to refer to them multiple times, choose to define those items of correspondence so that they can be easily distinguished from each other. That said, if we're going to just deal with them in discrete parts, we may not even need to bother about doing that, because if there's no confusion about the letter to which we're referring, then there's really no need to define the term. That's really the main purpose. Is there any potential for confusion if you don't define the term? If there isn't, you don't need to worry about it. If there is, define the term and make sure you're using it. Okay? But you do not need to define a single piece of correspondence to which you are replying. That leads into our next one, which is defining your client or our client. If I act for one party and you act for one party, there is no possible way in which the phrase our client can be confused, and there is no possible way in which your client could be a confusing term for anybody. Every single person knows who you're talking about if you're referring to your own client or to their client in circumstances where each of you only has one relevant client for the piece of correspondence. So why is it that we feel this sort of pathological obligation to define our client as a defined term? It achieves nothing other than, again, making us happy because we get to capitalize more things in the course of our correspondence. Now, again, that might change. What if you are acting for multiple parties? If you need to refer to your parties at any point in the singular as opposed to just our clients, sometimes you're only ever going to refer to them as a group because all of their interests are aligned. Again, you don't need a defined term there. You can just call them our clients. Everyone knows what you're talking about. But if you want to refer to them individually, you might choose to define them. But you might not. If you have a client called John Smith and you just refer to him as Mr. Smith and there are not any other Smiths in your client base, you have Mr. Smith, you have Mr. Smythe, you have Ms. Jones, and you have Mrs. McAnally. You don't need to define Mr. Smith. Everyone knows who Mr. Smith is because there's only one Mr. Smith. It doesn't require a defined term. It's not confusing. Everyone knows what you're talking about. However, if you had 3 Mr. Smiths, because you're acting for Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith's son, and Mr. Smith's son's son, then you might want to define those in some way, shape, or form. Corporations are an interesting one if you're acting for a corporation. Sometimes people insist on defining the corporation to a shortened version of itself. I can understand that if you're acting for ABC Manufacturing Plant Special Company, Pty Ltd, you might not want to type that out too many times in the course of a letter and you might just define it as ABC, or you could just call it our client and then need no defined term at all. But again, is there really any confusion? If you're acting for a company called ABC, whatever it is I said before, Pty Ltd, then if you just say ABC going forward, and there's nothing else that could be confused with, their client is something different and only your client is called this, and the topic does not require any other references to the alphabet, is there really any opportunity for confusion if you were to just say ABC without officially making it a defined term and putting it in brackets and, little quotation marks and making ABC as the defined term? I don't think there is, and I don't think it serves particularly great purpose. If you are not adding any clarity or precision to your writing and you are defining terms left, right, and center, it really is wasteful because apart from anything else, it distracts people. If you are seeking to achieve a particular purpose with your correspondence and you are defining things so often that people feel like they need to keep running back to the start to check the definitions to make sure they're not being verbaled in some way, then that's not a good use of it because they're going to lose the flow of your correspondence. And if you wrote it well, you should have written it in such a way that it's designed to be read and either persuasive or understood or whatever the case might be. And if they're jumping around all over the place, you're really going to have a hard time achieving that purpose in your correspondence. So while it's not the end of the world, it is a little bit of a negative if you're going to have defined terms, especially if they're unnecessary, because people might feel that sense of obligation to double check. Now, this is the other one with defined terms, that sometimes we define a term so broadly that it really isn't a helpful definition. Common one that comes up in Australia is when you're asking for further and better particulars of another party's pleading, and you spend 3 pages defining this term called the usual particulars, and then you just say, please provide the usual particulars of paragraphs 1 through 97 of your document. Well, that's not helpful. I don't know what you're actually asking, because the usual particulars refers to about 922 different circumstances that might apply. Basically what you said is, hey, could you just elaborate, but I'm not going to tell you how I want you to elaborate, nor am I going to tell you what I don't understand about your pleading, because I couldn't be bothered asking the question right. You've just unhelpfully defined something in such a broad way that it in fact is going to make it nearly impossible for the person to give you what you were sometimes legitimately, sometimes not legitimately, after seeking that clarification in their pleadings. So defined terms have to offer some sort of benefit to the communication. If they're not going to do that, then you really need to second guess why you might actually be doing it in the first place. Now, there are some different considerations that might come into play when you're drafting contracts, when you're doing legal submissions, when you're doing pleadings. There are slightly different rules there. You might want to offer a greater degree of precision sometimes for those things. Principally, though, in correspondence, you can apply those sorts of tests that I've just been mentioning, because if everyone knows what you're talking about, the definition doesn't really need to occur. So, defined terms, please use them less. Please use them sensibly. Don't just automatically add them into everything that happens to be a noun. It really isn't very helpful. It isn't particularly good legal drafting, and you might find that your letters actually start to read better if you don't do that. That's all I had, and I'll see you next time.